Our webinar on the role of the UN in promoting sustainable development in India. I am Professor Abhijit Banerjee in the Jindal School of Liberal Arts and Humanities. I teach a course on, my background is in environmental policy. I teach a course on global environmental governance. And this webinar is organized not primarily with that course in mind, but it's open to the wider community as well. We have exciting speakers from the UN, so I will introduce you to them in a moment. Let me just give you a brief introduction before we start introducing to the speakers. Introduction about what is the purpose, objective of this webinar. So the topic is the role of the UN. So why the UN? The UN has been central to global environmental governance since at least the 1970s. When we think of global environmental governance, we sometimes tend to feel disappointed, especially with the snail's pace of action in the global climate regime. And that's not the only one. If you look at the biodiversity regime, we have the equally disappointing outcomes. So we may feel disappointed. When the UN was established, it was seen as the last best hope of humanity. But it is fair to say that today we are more realistic and less idealistic. The UN has admirers and critics in equal measure. But it is important to appreciate that the UN is only ever going to be as good as its member states. The UN is not truly a sovereign entity, and if national political leaders constrain the work of the UN, then the UN can only do so much. However, outside of the often disappointing stalemate of international treaty negotiations, the UN continues to work behind the scenes on potentially transformative initiatives such as the Sdgs. The Sustainable Development Goals, as I hope we are all familiar with them, they're adopted in 2015. The SDGs are very comprehensive and cover almost every aspect of society and economy. So the UN's contribution can be potentially quite far-reaching. This work is perhaps not so well understood by most of us who are not students of the subject. And today's seminar will hopefully help us to gain a better appreciation. There are many UN agencies. And in India, we have the presence of at least a dozen UN agencies, and they all work at with slightly different aspects of slightly different goals and objectives. Today, we are fortunate to have with us representatives from three very important UN agencies that are directly related to environmental sustainability. There are many others who are somewhat indirectly related to environmental sustainability, but these three are quite directly related. So we will hear from our experts today, and hopefully we'll gain a better understanding of the role of the UN. Okay. So with that introduction, let me first introduce our speakers. So our first speaker providing opening remarks would be Dean Sudarshan. So Dean Sudarshan is known to our students as the Dean of the School of Government and Public Policy and a reputed scholar. But perhaps what people may not know is that he has had a leadership role in the United Nations for a long time before joining JGU. So that part of his background may not be so well known. So because of that background, he is an ideal speaker to provide opening remarks on the evolving role of the UN. So a little bit more details about his background. Professor Sudarshan is the founding dean of the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy at Jindal University. He obtained a master's degree in economics from the Delhi School of Economics in 1974. Then he was elected to a Rhodes Scholarship, joining Balliol College in Oxford, where he obtained a master's degree in politics in 1977. He held a research fellowship at St. John's College, Cambridge, where he studied judicial review of economic legislation, specializing in the interface of law and economics. In 1983, he was a visiting scholar at the School of Development Studies, University of East Anglia. From 1984 to 91, he served in the Ford Foundation's South Asia office in New Delhi as assistant representative and program officer for human rights and social justice. In 1991, he joined the UNDP in India as senior economist and assistant representative for governance and public policy. In 2000, he moved to UNDP in Jakarta as senior governance advisor. In 2002, he was appointed policy advisor for justice and governance in the UNDP Oslo Governance Center. In 2005, he joined the UNDP Asia Pacific Center in Bangkok as the regional policy advisor for governance, human rights, rule of law, justice, and legal reforms. His publications comprise edited books, articles, UN policy reports, reflecting his interdisciplinary research, teaching, and policy experience in human development, law, governance, institutions, and public policy. So you can see that we have a hugely experienced person who will provide us opening remarks about the evolution of the UN. The next speaker you can see on the screen is Dr. Preethi Sony from the UNDP in New Delhi. Dr. Sony has a wealth of program, policy, and research experience in the area of climate change and sustainable development. And she's been working in this area for more than 25 years. At present, she's working chief of the Climate Change, Resilience, and Energy Unit at UNDP, India. She has also worked as assistant country director, energy environment, advisor, climate change, and resource person for the UN Solution Exchange Environment Community at UNDP. Before that, she has worked at TERI as area convener for more than 2 decades. Dr. Sony has a PhD from the Institute of Environmental Studies at Vrije University in Amsterdam and the Institute of New Technology, United Nations University, Maastricht, also in the Netherlands. Before that, she has a master's in economics from the Delhi School of Economics, Delhi University. She has authored and published a number of papers in the area of climate change, energy, environment, and sustainable development. Okay. Our next speaker is Dr. Divya Dutt from the UNEP. She's currently the program manager at UN Environmental Program, a position she has held since 2019. Before that, she was at TERI for 20 years in progressively senior positions, including senior fellow and director of the Integrated Policy Analysis Program. Her areas of expertise include resource efficiency, circular economy, environmental policy, climate change, valuation of natural capital and ecosystem services, and resource federalism. She has worked closely with top policymaking bodies in India, such as the 13th Finance Commission, Ministry of Home Affairs, Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, as well as the Comptroller and Auditor General of India. She has MA and PhD in economics from JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Welcome. Our final speaker is Swathi Singh Samyar. She is a resource management researcher and expert, presently affiliated with the UN Habitat India office as a waste management specialist. She's leading interventions around sustainable resource management with a focus on plastics and municipal waste. Prior to joining UN Habitat, she headed the waste management program at the Center for Science and Environment in New Delhi for almost 10 years, leading several policy implementation and advocacy related interventions in India as well as the Global South. I might also add that Swathi is also a well-known media personality, and you can always see her in a lot of media publications on waste management issues. So we have a very exciting speaker list, and hopefully we'll all benefit from their expertise. And I might also add that I had a brief stint at the UN myself before joining JGU as a consultant for a brief period of about 6 months. And that is how I know many of these experts personally. And they graciously agreed to come and be guest speakers at our event. So with that introduction, it's time to turn over to Professor Sudarshan, Dean Sudarshan, and who will enlighten us with his opening remarks about the evolution of the role of the UN over the years, based on, but including insights from his own personal experience. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Abhijit. I think I see my long-term partner in multiple crimes in the United Nations Development Program, Suraj, if I'm right. who's joined this event. To begin with, a good point at which you remarked that the UN has its fair share of critics as well as some who appreciate what it does. So one way of looking at that and looking at the evidence for that is to examine what is it that the development arm of the United Nations set out to do, what has it accomplished, and what have the Bretton Woods institutions set out to do and what they accomplished. So in a way, there is a birth defect in that at the Bretton Woods conference, which created the International Monetary Fund and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, initially the idea was that all of development resources that the world could commit for reconstruction and development would be in with the United Nations. But that decision got changed, and you got this anomaly where what is actually the bank, the central bank to the world, the lender of last resort, the IMF, is called a fund, and what is actually a fund to help development, the IBRD, is called the World Bank. Now that's a interesting switch of nomenclature, but the initial idea really was that the United Nations should be in the driving seat in terms of reconstruction and development after the Second World War. That didn't happen. These two institutions got established in Washington because of the enormous influence of the United States then and as now. And these institutions have been largely dominated by an orthodox economics, and have set goals such as limiting inflation, macroeconomic stability, and growth, economic growth. But if you look at those targets across the world, particularly in the developing world, the IMF and the bank have failed to meet those goals. Macroeconomic stability is somewhat rare in Latin America, Africa, and many Asian countries. Growth has been poor, and indeed you might argue that structural adjustment programs and conditionalities imposed by the IMF may have actually worsened the situation of vulnerable people, has not substantially contributed to reduction in poverty, and has in fact reduced human development. So the United Nations, on the other hand, its goals, if you look at it historically, have been things like eradication of smallpox. The WHO took up that, and that's a phenomenal feat in the world to eliminate the smallpox virus entirely, and almost nearly so with polio, and a whole host of, now that we are in the middle of a pandemic, it's important to remember that the role of the United Nations institutions in containing these virus-based diseases has been spectacular. Ebola, even HIV/AIDS more recently, and the SARS. All of this, the UN system as a whole in these areas has accomplished a lot. We should also remember that the entire statistical system that the world now has, which has, so that you can compare the performance of economies in different countries, was initiated in the United Nations. And James Mead, economist who got the Nobel Prize, was involved in it. I.G. Patel from India was involved in that enterprise. And so the entire basis for statistics across the world and national system of accounts was in fact a UN initiative. And I'd say that the United Nations Development Program also began as a program of technical assistance to different countries. And if you think about it, very top thinkers in the development field have been associated with the United Nations. Sir Arthur Lewis was on the staff. Jan Tinbergen, James Mead, I mentioned, I.G. Patel. There are a slew of Richard Stone. All of them are top economists who worked for the United Nations and have put in place a system where there's a room for generation of ideas instead of a whole lot of people buying into one orthodoxy. The diversity of the UN allows for certain questioning of what you might call the prevailing orthodoxies in the development world. So that's to the credit of the United Nations. And also the United Nations has, over the years, organized a series of conferences that have accomplished a great deal. One example of that would be, for instance, we have two conventions in the UN, one on economic, social, and cultural rights, and a separate one on civil and political liberties. Now, these two were meant to provide, these two treaties were meant to incorporate, in a binding way on the UN members, the countries, the human rights that were adopted by the declaration, by the Human Rights Declaration. The Human Rights Declaration is called that because it's not binding in international law, so to speak. But these two treaties are. But there are two treaties because at the time they were adopted in 1966, is the height of the Cold War, and you had one set of countries committed to the Soviet Union and socialism of a kind, and another set of countries that stood in opposition to that, calling themselves the free world, and they couldn't agree on this because the socialist bloc emphasized economic, social, and cultural rights as important, including the right to work, whereas the free world, so-called, the United States and the Europe and United Kingdom, and they were influenced in a way by a very seminal article. As I'm saying, ideas influence things in which actually happen, and that's why it's important to pay attention to ideas. Isaiah Berlin wrote an article which is very seminal. That's called, he titled it Two Concepts of Liberty. And what he meant there was that there are certain rights that you could enforce. Say, for instance, free speech, you can enforce it through a court of law because all the court has to do is to direct the state not to interfere in somebody's expression of their thoughts and views in whatever media they choose to express it in. Or freedom of movement, you don't interfere with that, let people travel where they wish to. Right to form an association, you let people choose where they wish to go, form an association. The right to employment or jobs, residence, freedom of religion, all of these you are telling they are really freedoms from interference by the state. Whereas the right to education or the right to health requires investment of resources on the part of the state. So they are not so immediately enforceable in a sense in the way in which the civil and political liberties can be enforced. So therefore the two conventions where that some countries agreed to one set of rights and the other countries didn't agree to those sets of rights but agreed to an alternative sets of rights. So we have these two conventions, two treaties that are all binding on all countries anyway. But it took the United Nations in the 1991 conference in Vienna on human rights, where this Cold War divide was broken and a consensus was reached among all the member states of the UN that both sets of rights are important and are of equal weight and value. And all rights that are in these two treaties are in fact indivisible. So that's a advance in ideas, because as I mentioned, there were grounds to argue that the one that you should only call rights which could be immediately enforced by way of a remedy, and those that required resources and would require progressive realization should not be called rights, was the view that was changed because of the efforts of the United Nations. And it's in that conference that the UN decided to create an office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And now we have, with respect to protection of human rights, at least a mechanism by which there's something called the Universal Periodic Review, where each country produces a report, submits it to the Human Rights Council on what it has accomplished by way of protecting, promoting, and respecting human rights. And you have a peer group of countries that comment on it. And you also have civil society participating in it by way of forming a shadow report to the country report. And then you have the UN system giving its own views on that situation. So you've got now at least some measure of accountability among the member states about the human rights record. And this is quite a creditable accomplishment of the United Nations system. Now, with respect to development, what happened was that, as I mentioned, initially it was UNDP started life as a technical assistance body, and then was called the United Nations Development Program. So in the UN, you have organizations and you have funds and programs. So World Health Organization is an organization, the FAO is an organization, and they are in some sense a little different from funds and programs. UNICEF is a fund, the World Food Program is a program. So you have this distinction in the UN system. And when UNDP got established, its main purpose was to be a sort of a central funding mechanism, that contributions from member countries for development were channeled through the UNDP to the other agencies of the United Nations. So that's how it began. So UNDP would transfer money to, say, the WHO to implement a program, and the WHO would use those resources and keep 13% of it as administrative overheads, but the fund came from the UNDP. Now this changed because these other organizations began to, with the influence of their own boards, began to raise funds directly and didn't see the need for a channel in the United Nations system in UNDP to give them resources for what they were doing. And this change meant that the UNDP found itself at somewhat of a loss, because you could say that UNICEF cared for mothers and children, and WHO cared for health, and FAO was concerned about agriculture, and the World Tourism Organization did what it did, or the Civil Aviation Organization did what it did. But what is the UNDP to do once it lost its fund channeling mechanism? So that has been a bit of a dilemma for the UNDP as to what it is. And so the UNDP then hit upon the idea, and this was when Mark Malloch Brown, an Englishman, became its head, that it should be governance. Because by that time, there'd been a realization that there was, governance mattered for development. And this was a kind of a discovery in Africa. The World Bank suddenly realized that it's not simply getting the prices right that made a difference. Governance mattered. And therefore, the emphasis on improving governance systems in member countries was somewhat had been neglected, and the UNDP could, fill that role because it was not in the remit of other UN agencies. And so it began with governance. At this point, I must say that this was a bit controversial. I remember, going out to meet the Secretary External Affairs dealing with the UN in the Government of India with the resident representative and resident coordinator from here, from the India office. And we said, we announced this discovery that governance is going to be the main theme of UNDP. And this man, I remember his name was Mr. Lahiri. He kind of leaned back and he said to the res rep, I should point out to you that when the British were in India, they used to tell Indians, you Indians, you could either have good government or you could have self-government, but you can't have both. But you see, he said, we made the choice. Now, if we make mistakes in governance, we make the mistakes. Who are you to come and tell us how we should govern ourselves? So you see, this is a very sensitive area. And so that's why the program in the UNDP India office was not called governance. In many other countries, it is called governance. But there are sensitivities in countries like India where they didn't like the word governance. So this is part of, but the other big achievement of the United Nations Development Program, in a sense, in the realm of ideas, is the contributions that were made by Mahbub al-Haq and Amartya Sen. Mahbub al-Haq was an economist, senior economist in the World Bank. He was unhappy with the emphasis in the bank on measuring progress only by the gross domestic product and per capita gross domestic product. And so he moved to the UNDP to start the Human Development Report Office. And the basic idea is that, policymakers get influenced by numbers. They get influenced by an index, if you like. And the gross domestic product is a consolidated measure of what is produced in an economy by residents in that economy. That's the domestic product as differentiated from national product. And so that's what people focus on. We have to get our GDP growing. But that doesn't mean that human well-being is advanced, because you can get an increase in the GDP, say by increasing the production of tobacco and increasing the consumption of tobacco. GDP will grow if you produce more tobacco and tobacco products. And then people will consume it and become sick, and they'll go to doctors. And the more they visit hospitals and doctors, the more they will add to the GDP of the country, because what the doctors earn for their services will be counted positively into the GDP measure. But what it actually means is that human well-being has diminished and GDP has increased. So obviously you had to have a focus on human well-being, because that's what matters. It's not some abstract number called GDP that should concern you. And so Mahbub al-Haq and Amartya devised the Human Development Index, which is a kind of a crude index. Amartya was unhappy with it because he said, this is an unweighted index. It's crude and vulgar. And Mahbub al-Haq's response was, it's no more crude and vulgar than the GDP. And we need to introduce some such number in order to catch the attention of policymakers, to focus their attention on increasing the life expectancy of people, and in other words, improving the quality of health care in a country, to improve education and literacy in a country, and also to improve incomes. It's also part of the index. So this has been a major contribution in the realm of ideas. The Human Development Report has been successively published year after year. And the recent one has the innovation, and my colleagues in the UN system, or former colleagues in the UN system, would speak to that, because the latest Human Development Report adjusts the Human Development Index to what happens to the planet and nature. And this has been one of the limitations of economics, because in the conventional textbook economics, where there are 4 factors of production, nature is sort of assumed to be somewhat in the background. Natural resources and what happens to them is not factored in at a fundamental level, which is now beginning to happen. Partha Dasgupta, professor of economics in Cambridge, has made valuable contributions to economic theory in terms of incorporating into its theoretical premises what happens to natural resources, ecology, environment. And so the current Human Development Report centrally focuses on that and adjusts the index so that you are able to get a measure of at what cost have you accomplished, you've got your human development. And if you get it at the cost of depleting natural resources, harming the planet, then obviously you cannot be given credit for that modality. And so bringing such ideas to the forefront has been important. But it's so you could at one level generate ideas, you could have what you do. I remember Suraj saying, producing human development reports has become somewhat of an industry in itself. The Human Development Report is a means, and the end is actually improvement in human well-being. But if governments think that, pat themselves on the back because they've produced a Human Development Report, which states in India have done, and we also have district Human Development Reports, and worse, some village Human Development Reports, that becomes an end in itself. Well, that's not the point. The point about it is, has it influenced policies and so on. So I'd say that. I'd also say one of the things that the United Nations is continually doing, I mean, it's kind of touching that it does it, but it's continually trying to improve itself so that it can deliver on what it's supposed to deliver, right? So you have this constant sort of change management, transformation, this, that, and so on. The present Secretary General is also involved in it. He's created something called Umoja. Umoja is a Swahili word meaning unity, but it's basically an enterprise system, enterprise resource management system, which tries to integrate all these various multifarious activities of the United Nations onto one platform, in the hope that that kind of technological innovation or advance would make a difference to its effectiveness. There is a bit of naivety there. There's a bit of faith that the real difficulties in the UN system can be resolved by doing this. The real difficulties are this: that the UN is not one. There is the UN of the member states, and the member states don't give money to the development arm of the UN. They are all voluntary contributions. They are not assessed contributions as it is to the Secretariat and to the Security Council and the peacekeeping functions. These are voluntary. And what that means is they will fund projects and programs that they like, but they will not give enough resources to the agencies themselves. That is, UNDP's core budget is very, very small. But UNDP's program budget, in terms of what it does in different countries, is much larger because there's money available for that, but there's not money available for staff. For instance, I was based in Bangkok and had to fly out to multiple countries, whereas if the UNDP had the resources, there would have been qualified people in each of those countries helping with its work on a daily basis, instead of flying in somebody to hand out some suitcase advice and fly out. So that's not a very good way of doing it, but it had to be done that way because the core budget of the UNDP did not get contributed to the extent it should be. And this is the difficulty that remains. So this is created by the UN of the member countries. Then you have the UN of its own staff, which have a fair amount of autonomy. But then, you know, say, for instance, the Millennium Development Goals were all created by the UN staff after the adoption of the Millennium Declaration. And there's a hilarious account of, you know, how environment got into it. Mark Malloch Brown writes that, you know, they were sitting in a room working out what should be the development goals. And he came out of the room and found walking towards him was the head of UNEP. And he said, oh my God, you know, we've been sitting there formulating goals and we forgot this man. And he's heading an agency at the United Nations Environment Program. So let's go back and put something in there for environment. So that was done in that way. The SDGs, in contrast, were a little more systematically done with a series of consultations with what I call the third UN, which is civil society, intellectuals outside of the UN system, consulting them and so on. And so we have this. But with all these development goals, now you see we moved from, you know, the MDGs, 8 of them, to 17 sustainable development goals. But the origin of this really was with James Grant when he was heading UNICEF. He said, I'm now the head of UNICEF, what am I supposed to do? I go meet heads of state and governments. And so he decided that he will ask them to promise one thing. And the one thing he asked governments to promise was, get every child immunized in your country for all of the diseases to which there is a vaccination, right? And he said, I'll come back 2-3 years later and see what you have to tell me about this promise. And that promise got delivered. So that is the kernel of the idea that if you set goals, you can focus the attention of political leadership in achieving these goals, but then you can overdo it a little bit too. So, you have the Millennium Development Goals, and now if you ask any prime minister or president of a country to recite all the 17 sustainable development goals, they find it somewhat difficult. But nonetheless, governments are large entities, and it's a good idea to keep these goals and to monitor progress, because it ultimately contributes to human well-being. So that's what I'd have to say in a preliminary way to kick off. Thanks, Abhijit.
Okay, thank you, Dean Sudarshan, for the fascinating story about the evolution of the UN, not only the UNDP, but overall UN system, and how everything influences everything else, and the different constraints and important ideas. So we are much better, in a much better position to understand the, the way the UN is structured, and how and why different agencies function the way they do. So with that introduction, we'll move on to the next speaker. Just an announcement that all the Q&A we will handle at the end. So for now, we just move on to the next speaker, who is from the UNDP, Dr. Preethi Sony, as we already introduced her. She is the chief of the Climate Resilience, Energy and Climate Unit at the UNDP. And she has had a senior role at the UNDP in New Delhi for many years now, more than 20 years. So let's hand over to Dr. Preethi Sony and hear about what the UNDP is doing in India.
Thank you, Abhijit, and it's a pleasure to be here. It's good to be good to listen to you, Professor Sudarshan, and you provided a fascinating account of the journey of the UN and a whole historical perspective about UN as well as the UNDP. So what I'll talk about now and in the next 10 minutes is how UNDP stands as of now, focus more on the country office and also on the program that I'm dealing with, and give you a little account of what we are doing in India today and where do we stand. So I do have a few presentations, slides. If I can just share my screen and put that on. Just a second, please. Can you see it?
No, not yet, not yet.
Now?
No. IT, all the speakers have host privileges, right?
Yes, sir.
the
The
speaker is
host
trying.
has been disabled, I think.
Yes, sir.
IT, can you quickly check?
Yes, sir.
Or
Hello?
I can even go without the PPTs if it's okay.
I think there's an icon called share screen.
Yeah, but it says the host disabled.
So all the speakers, IT, all the speakers were enabled to share their screen.
Hello?
Abhijit, I think, just go on. And should I just
Hello?
presentation without PPT?
Vikas, do you want to say something?
You can add,
Hello?
please add Preethi as co-admin and then she can use this screen. That's all.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Okay, sir.
Yeah.
Now you try. Yes, yes. Yes. Now we can see. Preethi, go ahead.
Okay. So basically, like I was saying, and it's that it's an honor to be here and be amongst all of you. Honor to hear Dr. Sudarshan speak about the historical perspective, and also a delight to be in Miss Friends, Abhijit, Divya, Swathi, and also Suraj, who has been with in UNDP for long when I was also just joining. So it's a it's a real pleasure to be here. I'll just talk about how the UNDP stands now and what we are doing. Just a little about UNDP as of now. We are helping to, helping the various country governments to achieve eradication of poverty. That's the main aim, and reduction of inequalities and exclusion. On ground, as of now, UNDP works in more than 170 countries. And how we function is through the country offices, through the regional bureaus, and Dr. Sudarshan already gave you an account of that. Currently, we work on a strategic plan, which is an overall plan that has been agreed by all countries and all member countries and all the country offices and UNDP stakeholders. It's designed to be responsive to the wide variety of circumstances in different countries. So because of that, how we function at the country level, at the regional level differs because we also take the diversity into account. And the whole idea is to help in facilitating an achievement of the SDGs and helping to leave no one behind. The development contexts are in three major areas: eradicating poverty, providing structural transformation, that is in effect governance and other issues included in this, and building resilience to crisis, to climate change, to natural disasters. In response to these development contexts, there are something that is called signature solutions, and 6 signature solutions have been identified by UNDP in which we work right now. This includes poverty, governance, environment, energy, and climate change and gender. So those are the areas that we work in. And in this overall context, UNDP country office in India has been operational since 1951. So we do have a long history in working with the government. And if you go to the site, and the site address is written over here, you can actually look at the journey from the last 50 years, how UNDP has really made a difference and tried to make a difference in the development context of the country. As of now, we have about 30 projects on the ground and in almost all the states in the country. And all the programs are aligned with the national priorities and are reviewed and adjusted annually. So we work very closely with the government, map out the priorities of the government and the UNDP priorities to have our projects in place. These are structured around 3 thematic areas: inclusive growth, which is more focused on sustainable livelihoods, poverty reduction. Second is strengthening systems and institutions. This was earlier called governance, but now it's more on system strengthening, because we are looking at different systems for better governance in different parts of the country. And in context of the pandemic, we're also looking at health systems in a big way. In fact, UNDP is working with the Ministry of Health to look at the vaccination system as well and how we can support the country in that. And the third main thematic area is environment and energy. Like Professor Sudarshan said, this becomes a very important arm of UNDP because we believe that if you're looking at development context, we cannot look at it alone. We have to look at it from the environment perspective, from the climate perspective, and given the circumstances right now, we are going through the pandemic, but also it has just shown how interconnected the world is. If we're looking at climate change, the same kind of learnings and lessons come out. So this also becomes a major thematic area for all of us. And under that area, climate change, resilience, and energy is one of the important pillars. And I lead that pillar, and it's one of the major pillars of the country office. In fact, it's the largest. And the overall vision is that communities and ecosystems, so we deal with them together, are resilient to climate and disaster risk. They follow a sustainable and equitable consumption practices. And so we are looking at sustainable livelihoods under this pillar as well. And all of them should have equitable access to clean energy, natural resources, and all of it actually contributing towards SDGs. The key areas of intervention are climate change mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation more from the energy perspective, where we are looking at renewable energy, energy efficiency, and access to clean energy for the vulnerable communities, and adaptation to the vulnerable groups and ecosystems. Second major intervention is in the area of disaster management and resilience. A lot of us are also connected with climate change, but we are looking at natural disaster management in terms of the governance framework that India has and how we can implement it, both to be prepared in terms of what disaster could strike, and hopefully they wouldn't. But if they do, how can we really react to it and recover it? And in the past few years, we have seen a lot of disasters which are both man-made and nature-based. And these are like Fani, cyclone, and floods in Kerala. All these have shown that we need to be better prepared. And the government has been prepared now. And we are also playing a little role in making the communities and the government systems more aware and responsive to any disasters. The third main area is access to clean energy and efficient energy. This is for taking renewables for productive use. The government actually focuses more on lighting and cooking, but we want it to go beyond that to more productive use. So building entrepreneurship, looking at small and medium enterprises, cottage industries, and how we can improve the efficiency by including renewable energy in their production systems. This not only reduces cost, but also brings up in efficiency in the way that they work. Renewables across all the areas, especially in where energy is used a lot, like railways, transportation, building sectors. All these are important for renewables. In fact, we had a big project with the railways itself to improve the efficiency, and now we're working with the building sector to bring in building designs, to look at renewables, how we can work with the ministries to actually make that work. And the last is energy efficiency in this. But all these three are interrelated as we work towards better environment, better greening, and mainstreaming of environmental considerations in all we do. Secondly, building capacities, both institutional and stakeholder capacities, to have better systems in place and implement the policies that are already there. Bring in innovation and different financial models, prove the cost viability, so then it can be taken up by the government, and also help the government and other stakeholders in replicating the good practices or the lessons that have been learned through these interventions. And lastly, we also deal with partnerships, bringing different partners together so the voices from everybody can be heard during implementation or designing of policies. Climate change resilience and energy program in itself, there are 13 projects as of now in the 3 thematic areas, covering almost all the states. Abhijit also asked me to talk a little bit about the funding, and like Professor Sudarshan said, the core funding has reduced a lot for the country office in UNDP. So we rely on other sources and we do work to mobilize these resources as well. A lot of our funding for this group, that is climate change resilience, is from the multilateral funds that have been established especially to look at environmental issues. Two of the major ones are Global Environment Facility, which is under the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and also the Green Climate Fund, which is specifically for climate change. We also get funding from bilateral sources, that is, we have partnerships with TIFIT, SDC, and other bilaterals working in the country, and we work in partnership and collaboration for implementation of the projects and also leverage funding from them. And then just to also mention, JEF and GCF, we leverage the funding for the country and we help in the implementation. So we are the implementing agency for these multilateral funds that are available. And we help in designing of the projects. We help in the project assurance and making them work on the ground in partnership with the government. Bilateral, and we all, the other areas where we get funding from is the government cost sharing itself. We are a development partner of the government and we work together with them. So a lot of times government also provide the funding for implementation of their programs. And lastly, from the private sector, which is a new arm that we are actually exploring. We have got some partnerships already in place and we want to expand that. So that's the funding that we have. In terms of partnerships, these are also our partners. And currently this program is working with 4 central ministries: Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, Ministry of Home Affairs, where the disaster risk issues are really treated, Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, and Ministry of Rural Development. In addition, we are also working with MOUD and others, but as a collaboration, but the focus ministries are this. And we work with all the different state governments as well, either directly or through the central ministries. And in effect, we are contributing to different SDGs. Directly to SDG 7, energy, 13, climate change, 14, life underwater, where biodiversity and other resources are important, and 15, life over water, on land. So these are the major SDGs, but since climate change resilience is cross-cutting, and so is energy, they are very important for poverty alleviation. All the 3 are directly related. If you have energy transition, you have climate change as one of the areas that you address, and resilience of communities, then you can actually deal with all the SDGs. So in fact, we are actually working with all the SDGs. So how we work, that's what Abhijit also wanted me to talk to you about. If you're looking at JEF, the vertical funds, let me just take one example. Then the vertical funds, the Liaison with the GCF Secretariat or the GF Secretariat is done by our headquarters. What we do at the country office is design these projects with the government, with the other stakeholders. So under their ownership and request, we design the projects with them, align it to the JEF priorities, and work with our headquarters to submit it to the GCF and the JEF board and get approvals for this. Based on that, the delegation of authority and the funds come through us to the government. Of course, they are government funds and we help them to implement the projects in the long run. So that's how we work. There was another question on how we work with the different UN agencies. Within the country, within the UN structure, we have something called the results groups, where results groups, we have different results groups based on the direction and the focus of the UN in India. One of the results group is on climate change, energy, and resilience. And that is the one that UNDP actually leads. But we bring together all the different agencies that are working on these issues. So it could be UNICEF, UNESCO, UNIDO, UNEP, my partner is here, as well as the other agencies, FAO, UNFP. All of us come together. We decide at the beginning itself on how we are going to work together, synergize our efforts, and also do some joint programming. Recently, we had this whole new area of air pollution. It wasn't a new area, it was emerging, but it became really important in the last 2 years. So how do we work on it? What we did was we got all the agencies together. There was no direct focus of any of the agencies. So health used to work on air pollution from health perspective. UNDP used to work from climate change and other perspective, environment perspective on air pollution. But it was cross-cutting. So bringing all of them together, doing a kind of a recce and a scoping exercise, working with the key government partners, Health Ministry, Environment Ministry, CPCB, bringing everybody together and then going to the states. So that was how, that's how we do within the program itself. And the reporting is to the Niti Aayog every year on an annual basis and a biannual basis to review and adapt the program to government priorities. So that's how we are working in the different areas. Climate change resilience and energy is very important from the policy perspective. We have actually, there's the UNFCCC as the major convention, but how the NDCs relate to the UNFCCC and how do you actually implement the NDCs on the ground. So that kind of facilitation is done by UNDP, trying to bring that all of this together. Our program is looking at India and helping the Indian government in their efforts to achieve the global goal while keeping in mind the national priorities and the local capacities and bringing all of this together. Just to end, I'll just take one major project as one example of the kind of work that we do. We have recently helped India in designing a major project for funding under the Green Climate Fund. It is enhancing climate resilience of coastal communities in India. And the UNDP worked with the government and the various state partners to develop this project, got it submitted to the GCF board. We are also an accredited agency of the GCF, so we can help the government in developing and designing these programs. And after submission, we got the approval, and now we helped the country to actually launch it. This project was launched in 2019. In November. Formally, it was launched, and now we are looking at the implementation. Just to give you an idea that the nodal agency is Ministry of Environment and Forests, and there are 3 responsible agencies because the field implementation is in 3 states, Andhra Pradesh, Maharashtra, and Orissa. The project is actually designed to help the entire coast, but the on-ground intervention are in 12 districts in the 3 states mentioned here. Overall budget of the project is $130 million, out of which the GCF grant is for $43 million. And that has been leveraged because of the close collaboration and designing of the project by UNDP. The entire duration is for 6 years. Now, the aim of the project is to enhance the resilience by introducing ecosystem-based adaptation. Climate change, the coast is very vulnerable. We have a number of ecosystems which are the first line of defense to any climatic impact. So if we build the resilience of the ecosystem and the communities staying across the coast, then you bring in resilience of the vulnerable communities across the areas. And we have done it through 3 integrated outcomes. One is actual restoration and conservation of ecosystems. Second is looking at sustainable livelihoods, so that the communities living and dependent on these ecosystems use it on a more sustainable basis. And the third is to improve the governance structures so that coastal management also has elements of climate change and ecosystem-based adaptation included in it. And while doing so, we are also helping in the policy aspect, in helping in looking at NDCs, the National Action Plan on Climate Change, and the National Coastal Mission. And this is almost the last one where I'm just to tell you the extent or the transformative nature of this project, because we are working in 12 districts in 3 states in 24 targeted landscapes. Through this project, the intended impact would be actually benefiting and protecting and restoring 15,000 hectares of coastal ecosystems. These could be mangroves, salt marshes, seagrasses. So it's major if you really look at the coast. Improving livelihoods, we will actually help 10 million people in living around the shorelines would actually get benefit from this project. 1.7 million people, out of which 50% would be women, would get directly benefited through employment opportunities created through the project. And the third is the entire coastal system would get networking benefits. We can take our lessons to different countries, bring their lessons to us, and have a whole network of an institutional network of regulatory organizations and other stakeholders for better management of coastal resources, which is more ecosystem based. So this just shows that some of our projects, though aligned only to environment, do bring in the whole sustainable development benefit. They are closely aligned with the government priorities, help government to leverage international resources, but it's not only about the resources, but the actual intent of the project, which looks at the complete transformation. And this we have done in partnership with the government, with partnership with the state governments and the local stakeholders, and involving the GCF, the regional office, and also the country office. So that's how we work and how we really try to bring things together and make a little difference in the development scenario of the country. I'm happy to answer any questions at a later stage.
Okay, thank you very much, Preethi, for the nice overview of the role of the UNDP, how it works, and the cross-cutting themes which link almost every issue that we like: resilience, climate. This link every aspect of our society and economy. Okay, so now we will have questions at the end, but let's move on to the next speaker from UNEP. The United Nations Environmental Program was established after the 1970s, and it is a much more specialized agency, unlike the UNDP, which covers such a wide area of themes. The UNEP is much more specialized, and it is a relatively smaller agency, and we will hear from Dr. Dutt about what it is doing in India currently. Thank you.
Thank you, Abhijit. Are you able to hear me? Can you hear me, Abhijit?
Yes, go ahead.
And you can see my screen?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, great. Okay, so thank you very much. And let me also join Professor Sudarshan and Preethi in thanking you for inviting us to this event and for giving us this opportunity to interact with the students and tell them a little bit more about what the United Nations agencies are doing generally and in India in particular. So Preethi has already given an overview of some of the environment-related issues that UNDP is doing. There are areas of common interest between UNEP and UNDP, but there are also certain differences, and I'll come to those as I go through this presentation. I'll try and keep this short because I'm conscious that we have less than half an hour left in the program now. So as Abhijit just said, the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP, was established in 1972 as one of the key outcomes of the UN Conference on Human Development in Stockholm. It is headquartered in Nairobi in Kenya. In fact, it was the first agency to be headquartered in a third world country at that point in time. It is governed by the United Nations Environment Assembly, which is the world's highest sort of decision-making body in the environment, with membership of all 193 member states. The assembly meets once every 2 years to set priorities for global environmental policies, and it has had 5 sessions since it first started in 2014. On funding, which Abhijit asked me also to touch on, voluntary contributions from member states make up for the giant share of UNEP's budget, 95%. And this is through what we call the Environment Fund, which is a core source of flexible funds, which sort of gives UNEP the mandate to pick up priorities as it thinks appropriate in different parts of the world. In addition, there are earmarked funds, which are provided, which are more sort of programmatic, more thematic, and also regional in focus. And these come in the form of the funding from GEF, from GCF, and specific donors like the European Commission. This is a little text heavy, but I just wanted to give you a sense of how UNEP works. So I won't spend too much time on this, but this is just sort of indicative. So we have, like Abhijit said, UNEP is a more specialized agency. It's a more science-based normative agency, and the idea is essentially to provide policy guidance, advocacy, and norm setting for countries. We're not so much into implementation as UNDP is. UNEP has regional liaison and outpost offices, and it also has a growing network of collaborating centers of excellence across the world. We have at the moment, you can see here, regional offices in Africa, Asia and the Pacific, Europe, Latin America and the Caribbean, North America and West Asia. We also have several country offices now, India office being one of them. India office was established recently in 2016. And in a sense, it sort of started full-fledged operations only in 2018. So it's a very, very new, very small entity in India. But it is trying to sort of, align UNEP's broader global agenda with India's priorities. And I'll give you a sense of how we are doing that. But apart from this, UNEP also hosts the secretariats of many important multilateral environmental agreements and research bodies. These are global agreements like the Convention on Biological Diversity, CITES, which is the convention to regulate the international trade in endangered species, the various conventions related to chemicals, which is the Minamata Convention on Mercury, the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions on different types of chemicals, the two very important conventions on ozone depletion, the Vienna Convention and its Montreal Protocol. And Dr. Sudarshan spoke earlier about some of the achievements of the UN, and I would say that the action on the ozone layer, on preventing and stopping, arresting the depletion of the ozone layer is one of the big achievements of the United Nations system. And UNEP has played an important role in that, bringing together countries and setting very action-based agenda on how we can cut down on ozone depleting substances. The Convention on Migratory Species is another important convention that of which the Secretariat is at UNEP. Then there are regional conventions like the Carpathian Convention, which is a more European-based convention, the Bamako Convention, which is basically for hazardous and radioactive waste in Africa, the Tehran Convention around the Caspian Sea region. And there are several regional seas conventions for, that are more specific to the water bodies and marine ecosystems at a more regional level. UNEP has 8 divisions, which sort of steer the broad specialized work that UNEP does. So there is the economy division, which is focused on, offering platforms, policy options, pilots, and market mechanisms for different aspects of environmental issues. And, it works through 3 main branches: chemicals and health, energy, climate, and markets. Then there is an ecosystems division, which is more on managing different kinds of ecosystems. There is a science division, there is a law division. The law division also works with countries to combat illegal trafficking of wildlife. And then it is supported by 4 divisions: the communications division, the corporate services division, policy and program division, which essentially has the mandate to bring coherence and coordination at the strategic, policy, and programmatic level, both within UNEP and also with the larger UN system. And there is a governance affairs office. So this is the broad structure of UNEP. We work through what is called the medium-term strategy, which is a 4-year strategy. We are currently towards the end of our 2018-21 strategy. And there are 7 program areas of programmatic work, which are listed here, which are, and almost all of these are also of priority for us in India. And I will come to some of the sort of specific work that we are doing under these different programs, but this is to give you an overview of the areas of work that UNEP is engaged in globally. Of course, on all environment-related SDGs, UNEP is the lead agency within the UN system. It is also the custodian for 25 SDG indicators across these 6 environment-related SDGs. And it is working with member states to develop specific methodologies to not just sort of ensure the achievement of these SDGs, but also the monitoring of indicators and progress. And, you know, like Dr. Sudarshan said, analyzing that data to see what more needs to be done for these 6 SDGs, which have implications for almost all the other SDGs. Like I said at the beginning, UNEP is more a science normative based organizations, and we bring out the scientific assessment at a regular basis. Some of the important ones that you can look up, which are, which will also give you a good idea of, what the pressing environmental issues of our time are the emissions gap report, which is an annual report which tells us where we are headed in terms of the our targets for global warming are concerned, what are the levels of emissions and what parts of the world they're coming from, and what trajectory they will take us as far as global warming is concerned. Then there is the Global Environment Outlook, which gives an overview of environmental issues from around the world. It also has regional chapters. We also bring out what is called the Frontiers Report. And the Frontiers Report essentially brings out emerging environmental issues which we should start thinking about. And I think it was a 2016 Frontiers report which highlighted the issue of zoonotic diseases and said that this is one of the things to really get concerned about, to watch out for. And in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, there is another scientific assessment that has been brought out, which is to the extreme right, which is on how to prevent the next pandemic. And very recently, and I would really encourage all of you to look at this report, which is called Making Peace with Nature, where the idea is to bring all the scientific assessments of different environmental issues together in one place and see how these are interconnected and what messages are emerging for us to take action on. So it's a very important report, and I would, like I said, strongly encourage you all to take a look at this report, which is available on our website. Excuse me, just a second. Sorry about that. Apart from setting norms and bringing out scientific assessments, UNEP also leads campaigns through influencers, through goodwill ambassadors, through experts working on the ground. These are some of the important campaigns. You see here Dia Mirza, who's our goodwill ambassador in India, and this is part of a campaign called Wild for Life, where we've sort of taken up key endangered species, and we sort of have champions around the world advocating for the need to protect and preserve these species. The campaign that you see at the end is a very India-specific campaign that we did with the Airports Authority of India, which is called Not All Animals Migrate by Choice. And this, if you have noticed, this is an ongoing campaign, and it's sort of playing at about 25 airports across India, where these images flash in between various sort of travel-related messages that you will hear and see on the screens. So the idea is to, again, sensitize people to the routes and methods through which species such as the tiger, such as the pangolin, the turtle are being trafficked around the world. What we also do is, one of the core areas of UNEP's work is capacity building. So on all of these issues, we also work with key stakeholders on building capacity, including, in this case, we'll be working very closely with customs, with CISF, which is the Central Industrial Security Force, to see how, these are all the frontline officers and frontline enforcement agencies, on how capacity to control illegal trafficking can be created in the country. UNEP also has what we call awards to honor and celebrate individuals and institutions that are doing outstanding work for the environment. Two important awards are the Champions of the Earth Award and the Young Champions of the Earth Award, which is more recent. And you will see here that Prime Minister Modi received the award, I think it was 2018, for the work he's been doing on promoting solar as well as on plastics. And the picture you see down there is of Afroz Shah, who's been leading the action on cleaning beaches and drawing attention to marine plastic litter across beaches in India, particularly in Mumbai. And he was our Champions of the Earth in 2016. I'm going to end now, but I wanted to sort of just say that, you know, more than ever before, there is a need to understand the severity and the importance of the environmental issues that are facing us. We in UNEP look at this in terms of 3 planetary crises: the crisis of climate change. I'm not going to get into the numbers. You know, you can read about these. There is the crisis of biodiversity loss, and there is a crisis of pollution. And each of these crises are not only interlinked, but together they are creating a great threat for the survival of mankind on Earth. And this is not just, you know, just sort of English speaking, but if you look at some of the reports that are coming out, it is a cause of great worry. There is, you know, if you look at some of the work that is being done by the Stockholm Environment Institute, for instance, they talk about the planetary boundaries. And I think there are 9 odd planetary boundaries, and about 4 of them have already been transgressed, which means that the Earth is in a uncertain sort of realm where we really don't know how things are going to play out. So we're already in that, you know, in that zone of uncertainty on several of these environmental parameters, with very deep-rooted implications for socioeconomic development and existence of mankind. And in, you know, you may have been reading that the current COVID-19 outbreak, which is a zoonotic outbreak, is also one of the manifestations of this environmental crisis that we're going through. Very quickly, you know, some of the environmental issues that we spoke about globally are also very much relevant for India. Some statistics for India here, but I'm not going to them. But, you know, air pollution is a big issue. Water is an issue. India is also very vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Plastic pollution is an issue. And through our work, we are trying to address some of these issues. UNEP's priorities in India include air pollution, plastic pollution and marine litter, chemicals and hazardous waste. We are doing some, you know, work not only on overall monitoring of chemicals and waste, but also specific chemicals like DDT and finding solutions for DDT. Sustainable agriculture is an important area of work, where on the one hand, we are looking at alternatives such as ZBNF, which is a sort of low chemical use agriculture, but also looking at approaches such as, you know, integrating the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity in decision-making in the agriculture sector. So how can we actually put a value on some of the ecosystem services that alternative forms of agriculture provide, and these can be made part of policy making. So very much on the lines of, you know, new thinking that Professor Sudarshan was talking about, you know, how we brought human development report and human development indicators along with GDP. We're also looking at how you can bring in, you know, values of nature now as part of mainstream decision making, as part of mainstream economic tracking and monitoring. And clean energy solutions, we work very closely with UNDP, and, you know, Preethi spoke about some of the issues that are being done there. So yeah, these pictures, I just wanted to, you know, you'll see there's some pictures on sustainable fashion that I have up there. So we're also working, this is one of our important campaigns, working with the fashion industry on seeing how fashion and the textile sector can be made more sustainable. Because often we don't realize, but textiles, food, these are all sectors with huge environmental footprints in terms of resource use and pollution. So we are working very closely with some of the stakeholders in these sectors to see how their environmental footprint can be made smaller. So thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions. And I invite you to visit the website of UNEP and study and read in more detail about all the activities that UNEP is doing in India and across the world. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Divya. So we heard a lot about the UN specialized work on individual issues of concern, including issues of priority in India. I would particularly like to focus the students' attention on the reports that Divya highlighted. We do use UN reports. UNEP reports are fascinating. We do use a lot of them in our course. Just for this week, we have been using UN UNEP report on waste, illegal hazardous waste smuggling in our class. So UN reports are very detailed and fascinating. I haven't read the Making Peace with Nature one myself, so I look forward to read it myself, and I'll recommend it to all these reports to everyone. With that, let's quickly move on to our last speaker, Swathi from UN Habitat. And UN Habitat is also a relatively new agency, and we will hear about their specialized role in promoting sustainable cities. Swathi, we can see the screen, but we can't see you. We can't see you, or we can't hear you.
Okay, my video camera is open, Abhijit.
Now we can see you, we can hear you, and we can see the slide. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, Abhijit, Professor Sudarshan, for having me over. I think lovely insights. I could myself pick up on a lot of work that's happening with UNDP, UNEP, of course, I very closely follow what's happening. As Abhijit said and mentioned later, UN Habitat is fairly, a smaller organization, and the core focus is on achieving the targets of SDG 11. So probably I'll start with a brief history. What do we focus on, and what are the core interventions that we are undertaking in India? Okay. Yes. So if you look into the history, mandate, and role of UN Habitat, on 1st January 1975, the UN General Assembly established the United Nations Habitat and Human Settlement Foundation, which was the first official UN body dedicated to urbanization. Then under the umbrella of UNEP, its task was to assist national programs related to human settlements through the provision of capital and technical assistance, particularly in developing countries. The first international UN conference that fully recognized the challenge of urbanization, it was held in Vancouver, Canada in 1976. Where the conference sort of resulted in creation of two important bodies. One was the United Nations Commissions on Human Settlements, which is an intergovernment body, and the United Nations Center for Human Settlement, which we commonly now, it's referred to as the Habitat, which served as the executive secretariat of the Commission. In 1996, the United Nations held a second conference on cities, which was held in Istanbul, Turkey. And basically, this conference led to declaration by 171 countries, and a political document, which was called the Habitat Agenda, came out of the City Summit, which contained about 100 commitments and 600 recommendations. Following this, on 1st January 2002, through General Assembly resolution, Habitat's mandate was strengthened and its status was elevated to a fully fledged program in the UN system, giving birth to UN Habitat, which is now what we call the United Nations Human Settlement Program. In 2015, the member states approved the SDGs, including a dedicated goal for urban development, which we all know as SDG 11, which calls to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. A year later, at the UN Conference on Housing and Sustainable Urban Development, Habitat 3, member states signed the new urban agenda, which is an action-oriented document which sets global standards of achieving SDG 11, rethinking the way we build, manage, and live in cities. Now, looking into the new urban agenda, basically the idea is to build a roadmap for building cities which could serve as engines of prosperity and centers of cultural and social well-being while protecting the environment. The agenda also provides guidance for achieving the SDGs, and it provides the underpinning for actions to address climate change. Looking into habitat and its work at a glance, we all know that cities are facing unprecedented demographic, environment, social, economical, and spatial challenges. And there's been a phenomenal shift towards urbanization, with 6 out of every 10 people in the world expected to reside in urban areas by 2030. And over 90% of this growth is being witnessed in Africa, in Latin America, Asia. And based on the learnings from the engagement in India for the past 3 years, UN Habitat is proposing an integrated and demand-driven approach, which combines refining urban planning and designing frameworks, also implementing pilot projects for learning by doing, mainstreaming innovations through testing technology solutions and engaging multiple stakeholders. So our idea is also to influence policy, but then at the same time to pilot implementation projects, working with various actors as well as stakeholders. Looking into our focus areas, they are the following. One being safe, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable cities and regions. Secondly, being affordable, green, and resilient housing and environment. Third, promoting safe, well-planned, and service neighborhoods. Fourth, accountable and efficient urban governance, and the last being knowledge systematization and learning. And in the face of the pandemic, I think most of us living in cities must have witnessed that all these realms were sort of exposed. So how do we work in order to strengthen these areas is broadly the goal of the organization. And looking into all these 5 verticals, our idea is, our major mandate is to work on technical diagnosis, to influence and address policies and reforms, working closely with central as well as state actors, also working widely on advocacy and outreach, and scaling solutions by implementing demonstrable pilots on the ground. And we do this by engaging with various actors. It's public sector, civic society, other UN agencies and partner agencies, community-based organizations, self-help group, and media network. If we look into India's urban agenda, India will be one of the defining projects of the 21st century. And India is one among the largest urban systems in the world, with about 32% of the total population living in urban areas, which will increase to further 40% by 2030, including 7 mega cities. And we all know that urbanization has brought in significant contribution to Indian economy, with over 60% of India's GDP coming from cities and towns. And this is estimated to increase to about 75% by 2030. And urbanization done right has the potential to fuel not only sustainability, but also to bring millions more out of poverty rapidly in the coming years. In India, we are spearheading the pillar on poverty and urbanization, and we propose to handle cities by developing enabling frameworks for people-centered planning, by improving housing access to marginalized communities, by improving capacity building programs as part of UN Sustainable Development Framework signed between UN agencies and Niti Aayog. We are also expanding our support on the implementation of the new urban agenda to achieve the SDG 11. And we all do this by adopting a people-centric approach to bring synergies in urban policy and planning instruments, to refine urban development and design frameworks that lead to spatially strategic capital investment projects for sustainable, resilient, safe, and inclusive urban future, ensuring that no one is left behind. In terms of funding, which Abhijit sort of asked all of us, around 80% of UN Habitat's funds come from national governments. Other donors include local authorities, UN agencies, private sector, and civil society. And against the back, as I said, the main focus is implementing the SDG 11 and the new urban agenda. And as a focal point on sustainable urbanization, one of UN Habitat's key role is also to localize the SDGs based on local conditions and looking into addressing vulnerabilities in our countries. What are we missing in making Indian cities livable and the work that we are doing? One being planning legislation needs to be overhauled in conjunction with the legal framework related to urban land. For instance, the conventional master plans that have proved to be, we all know looking into them that they've proved to be unwieldy and impossible to implement, while new age comprehensive development plans have yet to be brought into the mainstream of the legislative framework. Another, that Indian cities need more equitable as well as efficient systems of planning, stakeholder engagement, and provision and management of services. Addressing urban poverty, lack of decent shelter and urban services, and the challenges of slums and homelessness, it needs to be accorded the highest priority. Third, safety and security in cities. It cannot be viewed as an optional extra, but as a central concern of livability. Security against natural and man-made disasters, as well as crime, can be enhanced significantly through better planning practices, implementation and enforcement of appropriate zoning and building regulations, and the provisions of basic amenities such as water, sanitation, and electricity lighting. This will in turn contribute significantly to making cities resilient as well as inclusive. The approach towards historic city centers needs to shift from heritage conservation to sustainable urban revitalization. This is critical to make it people-centric in general and pro-poor. Historic districts not only provide a sense of place and authenticity to cities, but are also important economic and social hubs whose development needs to be integrated with the rest of the city. Next, better and more reliable spatial as well as socioeconomic data is needed to make policy decisions that are suitable to different stakeholders in India's towns and cities. Now, this requires not only technological solutions, but also a change in mindset and needs to be built into planning, education systems, and curricula. Finally, laws and policies need to be changed, institutions need to be transformed, capacities need to be upgraded, and most importantly, citizens need to be empowered if Indian cities are to fulfill their enormous potential and become livable for generations to come. So these are the following mandates that we're sort of following. In terms of projects in India, we're working.
Swathi, may I interrupt quickly? We are, since we're going over time, would you be able to finish by 40?
Maybe a minute more, Abhijit.
Yeah, that's fine.
Quickly run through.
Thank you.
So in India, we're working on several projects and programs on prioritizing sustainable urbanization in cities via cross-sectoral approaches and working with relevant state departments, local agencies, and central line agencies like MAHUA. The first one being the Sustainable Cities Integrated Approach Pilot, which is a project that we are working with JEF, UNIDO, NIUA, and MAHUA. And the idea of this project is to work around reducing GNG emissions, and it's based in 5 target cities in 4 states across the country. The second project is on tackling plastic waste in the environment, where we are working in 2 coastal cities in India. The project's objective is to assess plastic leakages and build scalable demonstration plans for the city to adopt based on the assessment. The third one is Leave No One Behind, that is based on SDG 11 and 6 in urban areas. The project draws on the collective expertise of UN Habitat, UNESCAP, and UNOICT, covering 4 countries of South Asia. We're also working on Urban Leds 2, where UN Habitat is supporting Government of India to develop a multi-level governance framework to enhance configuration of roles and responsibilities across national, international, local government entities with an eye towards achieving the NDC pledge. And fifth, of course, we have an advisory role and in terms of providing technical assistance to Mahua and our various stakeholders, right from state governments to our city partners. So, so yeah, I mean, that in a nutshell was UN Habitat and its work. And of course, you can always look up to the website to read about various areas in detail. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Swathi, for a short but very informative account of the role of UN Habitat in India, focusing on key issues, key priorities. We have very short time left since we're already over time. We have a very short time left for question and answers. That's why we would just focus on questions from students. So if students have any questions, please type them in the chat box. Meanwhile, I will maybe perhaps we already have one question from a student. Okay, a good question from our student Jayendra that I'm just putting in a nutshell that with the COVID, everything seems to have set back. All our progress, much of our progress seems to have set back, whether it's in terms of finances or in terms of really affecting people on the ground. Going forward, how do the UN agencies think about the recovery? How would you approach things differently, or how would you approach the recovery? So anyone, perhaps UNDP, can take this question.
Okay. So like you rightly said, COVID has impacted. COVID has now impacted almost everything. In fact, Professor Sudarshan also mentioned the Human Development Report. This time's report actually showed that because of the pandemic and the losses, the economic and social losses, because of the lockdown and other situations, for the first time since we started doing the HDR, there is a whole indication that the NGR would actually be reversed. The human development will go down for the first time. So this is major for us, and it is going to impact everything that we do. On the other hand, it also showed an opportunity to do things better, in a better manner, build back better. So that's the other side of the story. And it also showed how things can be done. We can work in a different paradigm. We can work more efficiently by reducing and causing less impact on the environment. So as we move along, if you actually read the HDR, it also talks about we have to now start looking at planet and the people together. So economics as well as environment in a more integrated manner. And even for UNDP, and I will also like to, I will be right if I actually talk about the other stakeholders as well, including other agencies. We are now going to focus more on integrated approaches where environment and economic considerations are looked at it in an integrated manner. While we are looking at green recovery, we are looking at focusing more on green recovery issues where we can have more environmental sustainable recovery, in which we do a focus on building back better for not only the near term, but the longer term as well. So there were some talks about and how we look at green jobs, how we look at sustainability, more resilience, but bringing in environmental considerations in all we do. In fact, I would really encourage you to also look at the HDR, which kind of completely points out because of social norms, because of incentives, and the regulations and nature-based solutions. Those are some of the things that we need to focus on. In fact, all over the globe, even under climate change negotiation, now there is a big thrust on nature-based solutions. Looking at, and that was one of the examples I also gave, which was looking at ecosystems. So for climate vulnerability reduction. So if you, one of the things is if you look at nature-based solutions, you're not only addressing climate change, you're also looking at other things. So in a nutshell, basically the paradigm shift for all the agencies would be to focus and integrate environmental and economic considerations a bit more. in the longer run and in the short run.
Abhijit, can I add
Yeah.
to Dr. Preethi's?
Yes, yes, very, very quickly. Yes.
Yeah, I think that was a wonderful question. And as we all know, and Dr. Preethi also mentioned that the pandemic has exposed vulnerabilities, especially for people living informally in slums, unauthorized colonies and dwellings which lack adequate space, sanitation facilities, and proper hygiene measures. So placing housing at the center underscores the deeply entrenched urban plight of our cities. Also, the future is green, as we have exhausted the spaces for green in most of the dense urban areas. Post-COVID-19 world stares at an eco-friendly urbanism. And in the last year, the world sought solace in confined spaces. People started to realize the importance of the healthy urban spaces. So there is a rise in urban farming, including vertical and rooftop farms, and city dwellers starting to grow, basically their own gardens in their houses, providing a potentially lasting boost to urban farming. So I think a lot of innovative approaches in terms of greening urban centers and urban spaces is sort of the need of the hour. And as compared to the West, of course, cities in India sort of reflect a largely organic and chaotic scenario, with the planning and provisions of housing, infrastructure, and basic services constantly playing catch up with such growth. So I think it's high time that all these interventions sort of address these major areas while living in cities, to sort of address the vulnerable populations, but also to sort of have better growth and sustainability as we plan our cities.
Thank you. Just a quick question to Divya, just a 1 minute answer. You're a small agency and you have a very ambitious list of priorities. How do, just to let our students understand, with a handful of people in the New Delhi office, how do you work on all these priorities? Do you, do you subcontract it out to partners? And how do you make sure that after your project ends, 1 year project ends, how do things get a continuity? Just 1 minute answer.
Okay, thank you, Abhijit. That's a very good question. It's a question we are also grappling with, because as we started work in India, we realized there was just so much that we wanted to sort of, get into. But so there are two things. One is that UNEP by mandate is a normative agency, like I said, so we don't get into implementation like UNDP. So our approach is a little different. We work more on, on engaging with policymakers and other decision makers on the changes that are required. We do this both by bringing our global expertise, because we have a lot of domain expertise around the world in UNEP offices around the world. So we bring those, and we bring, like you said, we also bring, subject experts within the country by subcontracting them or involving them in consultations. So it's a mix of pulling in our own resources, but we try as much as possible to use the local expertise and the local knowledge that is available by, formally or informally bringing those resources and that knowledge into the process. As far as sustainability is concerned, one of our core mandates is to build capacity. So wherever we are working, the idea is to pass on that capacity for sustaining initiatives after we have retreated. So yeah, I would say capacity building is the main modus through which we are trying to make these projects self-sustaining in the long term. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for a short but very helpful answer to that question. Unfortunately, we don't have time. Our IT team informed us that we have to end right away. They have a new session beginning. So I would take this opportunity to thank all the speakers for taking the time on a Saturday and helping our students understand how, not only with Dean Sudarshan, how the UN's role has evolved over time, what were the different influences, and with other speakers from specialized agencies, how these agencies work. Some agencies are big, some agencies are small, but all of them are doing important work in their own way. They have some of the ways of working are common, but some ways of working are slightly different from each other, and how these UN agencies coordinate with each other. for many of these topics are cross-cutting. So we heard that they have these priority areas where they work together with common priorities and programs. So I hope that students have got a better understanding of how these UN agencies work. We have one student who has had a question, not for the session, but is thinking about internships and fellowships for in the future. So we will pass those questions later to our UN experts, and hopefully some of our students after they graduate may even get opportunities working with the UN in some capacity. So I would again like to thank all the participants for their attendance, and also the design team for designing the posters, the IT team for the IT support. And with that, we would like to end the session for today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Abhijit.
Thank you, Abhijit. Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Yeah, it's over. It's over now. I don't think so. I don't think so.